When a person with nothing is given a choice, it's rarely a choice at all. For 18 years, my life had been a series of doors closing behind me, each one locking automatically. I left my childhood home in a social worker's car. I left foster care with a single duffel bag. And when I finally left my relationship, escaping the quiet suffocation of a life I'd mistaken for stability, I found myself homeless on a bus station bench, with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and a key to a place I'd never been. A place that, I was told, was worse than nothing. That's when I took shelter on an empty, forgotten farm and discovered the livestock were moving on their own. What I found there wasn't just about a strange inheritance. It was about the secrets we bury and the battles we inherit without ever knowing it. If you've ever felt lost or had to start over from zero, then this story is for you. Stick with me and maybe even subscribe, because we're going to talk about what it means to find a home in the most broken of places. The bus groaned to a halt at a crossroads marked only by a leaning stop sign and a gravel turnout. There was no station, no shelter, just the wide gray mouth of a country road disappearing into a landscape of skeletal trees and fallow fields. The driver looked at me in his rear-view mirror, his expression a flat mix of pity and professional indifference. "This is it, kid. Miller's Crossing. You sure this is right?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I was sure of nothing except that I couldn't go back. I grabbed my thin backpack, the only thing I owned besides the worn-out coat on my back, and stepped down into the cold. The bus hissed and pulled away, leaving me in a sudden, ringing silence. The air was different here. It was heavy and damp, smelling of wet earth and decay. It filled my lungs and seemed to settle in my bones, a physical weight. In my pocket, my fingers found the cold, jagged edges of the key. It was an old iron skeleton key, sent to me in a stiff manila envelope by a lawyer I'd never met. Along with it was a deed, the paper brittle and yellowed, for a property listed as 30 acres with farmhouse and outbuildings. It had belonged to my grandfather, a man I barely remembered, a ghost from a life before the system took over. He'd passed away 2 months ago. The letter from the lawyer, a Ms. Albright, had been brief and formal. It was a notification of inheritance, but it read more like a warning. I started walking. The gravel crunched under my worn-out sneakers, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet. The road was lined with a collapsing fence of gray wood and rusted wire. Beyond it, the fields were a matted mess of brown and gold weeds, shivering in the wind. It was late afternoon, and the sky was the color of a bruise, a low-slung blanket of clouds that promised a cold night. I pulled my coat tighter. It had been Mark's, too big for me, thin at the elbows, but it was all I had. Leaving him had been less a dramatic explosion and more a quiet, final closing of a door. I'd packed nothing. I just walked out while he was at work, leaving behind 2 years of my life in a small apartment that had never once felt like home. The silence there was just as loud as this, but it was an empty silence. This was different. This silence was full of whispers, the rustle of wind in the dead cornstalks, the distant caw of a crow, the creak of my own weary body. After about a mile, I saw it. The farmhouse was set back from the road, a dark shape against the darkening sky. It was a 2-story box with a sagging porch roof, its windows like vacant eyes. A once white picket fence, now mostly toothless, separated it from the road. The gate hung from a single hinge. This was it, my inheritance, my sanctuary. It looked like a haunted house from a cheap horror movie. A dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Of course. Of course. This is what was waiting for me. It was perfect. I pushed the gate open. It screamed in protest. The path to the house was overgrown with weeds, their tendrils grabbing at my ankles as I walked. The porch steps groaned under my weight, and I tested each one before putting my full trust in it. The front door was painted a faded blue, the paint peeling away in long strips, like sunburnt skin. The lock was old and rusted. I slid the iron key in. For a moment it wouldn't turn. My heart sank. The thought of sleeping outside, in this cold, with nowhere to go. It was a familiar terror, one I thought I'd escaped. I rattled the key, pushing with a desperate strength I didn't know I had. With a deafening clank, the lock turned. The door swung inward on a gust of stale, musty air. It smelled of dust, mice, and something else. Something like old memories. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, shutting out the gray world. The silence in here was even deeper. It was absolute. The silence of a place that had been left to die. I stood in the entryway, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting from the dirty windows. To my left was a living room, furniture draped in white sheets like a congregation of ghosts. To my right, a staircase led up into darkness. I was exhausted. A deep, soul-crushing weariness that went beyond the bus ride and the long walk. It was the exhaustion of years of being temporary, of being a guest in other people's lives. For the first time since I was a child, I was in a place that was, technically, mine. And it was broken, just like me. I didn't explore. I didn't have the energy. I walked into the living room, pulled a sheet off a lumpy sofa, and collapsed onto it, not even bothering to take off my coat or shoes. Sleep came instantly, a dark, dreamless blanket. It wasn't a restful sleep, it was an escape. I woke to a profound and unsettling cold. The last of the daylight had vanished, and the house was submerged in a thick, inky blackness. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at my skin. I fumbled in my backpack for my phone. The screen flared to life, a small, brave island of light. 20% battery. I used its faint glow to look around. The sheet-covered furniture seemed to lean in toward me. The shadows in the corners of the room were deep and absolute. Every creak of the old house settling was the footstep of an intruder. I had to get up, find a light switch, anything. But my body felt heavy, pinned to the sofa by fear and cold. Then I saw it. Through the grime of the living room window, something was different. In the field across the driveway, bathed in the faint, watery moonlight that had broken through the clouds, stood a small flock of sheep. Except they weren't sheep. I'd noticed them vaguely on my way in. They were sculptures, life-sized, made of what looked like rusted scrap metal, welded together with a strange, brutalist artistry. There were maybe 5 or 6 of them, frozen in various poses of grazing. But one of them, the one closest to the house, wasn't where I remembered it being. When I arrived, it had been facing the road. Now, its blank metal head was turned toward the house. My mind raced. Was I just misremembering? I was tired, disoriented. Of course I was. I hadn't paid that much attention. It was a trick of the light, of the shadows, of my own frayed nerves. It had to be. I told myself that, over and over. A desperate mantra against the rising tide of fear. I found a light switch on the wall, and with a hopeful flick, was rewarded with nothing. Of course, the power was off. The water, too, I discovered, after a fruitless trip to the kitchen sink. This was a shell of a home, not a home. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the sofa, my phone's flashlight on until the battery died, leaving me alone again in the total darkness. I listened to the wind howling around the corners of the house, and I tried not to think about the metal sheep standing silent vigil in the moonlight, its head now turned toward me. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it was almost a physical touch. The next morning, I woke up stiff and sore, the cold having seeped deep into my joints. The gray morning light felt like a blessing. In the daylight, the house was less menacing, more just sad. A place full of echoes. My first order of business was survival. I had a few crumpled bills in my pocket, enough for a bus ticket and not much else. I had an appointment with the lawyer, Ms. Albright, at 10. Her office was in the nearby town, a place called Havenwood, about 5 miles away. I'd have to walk. Before I left, I forced myself to look out the window again. The metal sheep was exactly where I'd seen it last night, its head still angled toward the house. I walked outside, my boots sinking into the damp soil. I approached it cautiously. Up close, it was an incredible piece of work. The body was formed from a rusted car hood, the legs from rebar, the head from an old gas can. The eyes were just empty holes, but they seemed to hold a profound emptiness. I pushed against it. It didn't budge. It was incredibly heavy, rooted to the earth. There was no way the wind could have moved it, and there were no tracks around it in the soft ground besides my own. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. I backed away slowly and started my walk to town, trying to push the image from my mind. The walk was long, but it felt good to be moving, to be doing something. Havenwood was a small, tidy town with a main street lined with brick buildings. Albright & Sons, attorneys at law, was in one of them, on the second floor above a hardware store. The stairs creaked. The whole world seemed to creak. Ms. Albright's office was neat and smelled of old paper and lemon polish. She was a woman in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You're Elara," she said, not as a question. She gestured to a worn leather chair. "I was your grandfather's lawyer. I'm sorry for your loss." I mumbled a thank you. "I'll be direct," she continued, folding her hands on the large oak desk between us. "Your grandfather, Arthur, left you everything, which, I'm afraid, amounts to the farm and a significant amount of debt." She slid a folder across the desk. "The property has 2 mortgages on it. Furthermore, the property taxes haven't been paid in 3 years. In total, you are inheriting a liability of approximately $150,000. I stared at her. The number was meaningless. It was so far beyond anything I could comprehend, it might as well have been $1 billion. "The bank will begin foreclosure proceedings within 90 days, she said, her tone flat and factual. "There is, however, an offer on the table." She pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Oakwood Development has been trying to acquire your grandfather's land for some time. They own most of the surrounding parcels. They are prepared to offer you $10,000 for the property. It's not much, but it would be enough to satisfy the creditors and leave you with a small amount to start over. Frankly, it's your only viable option." $10,000. To erase $150,000 of debt and walk away with a few thousand. It was a lifeline. It was a plane ticket to somewhere warm, a deposit on an apartment, a chance to not be homeless. It was the smart choice, the only choice. "Why did he keep it?" I asked, my voice small. "If it was so much trouble." Ms. Albright sighed, a rare crack in her professional armor. "Your grandfather was a stubborn man. He loved that land, said it was his history, his art. He refused to sell, no matter how many times they increased their offer. He got it into his head that they were trying to cheat him." "Were they?" She gave me a pitying look. "Ilara, Oakwood is a multi-million-dollar corporation. The land is assessed at a low value due to its agricultural zoning and lack of utilities. Their offer is technically fair market value. Your grandfather was an artist, not a businessman. He was drowning, and he refused to grab the rope." The logic was cold, hard, and inescapable. I was my grandfather's heir. I was inheriting his failure. "I need to think about it," I said, though I knew what the answer had to be. "You have a few days," she said, standing up. "The offer is on the table, but don't take too long. The foreclosure clock is ticking." I walked out of her office and back down the creaking stairs, the weight of that $150,000 pressing down on me. It was an anchor, and Oakwood Development was offering to cut the rope. All I had to do was let go of the one thing my grandfather had left me. The walk back to the farm felt different, longer. The gray sky seemed to press down on the land, smothering it. The farm wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a trap. a $150,000 trap. When I got back, the first thing I did was look for the sheep. It was still there, still staring at the house. I felt a flicker of anger. It was all part of the same story: a broken-down house, a mountain of debt, and a field of junk metal. My grandfather hadn't left me a home. He'd left me a mess, a testament to his own stubborn pride. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, walking through the rooms of the silent house. I touched the dusty sheets, the cold window panes, the peeling paint. I was looking for something, anything, that felt like him, like family. But there was nothing, just emptiness. The lawyer's words echoed in my head. A stubborn man. He refused to grab the rope. I could see it so clearly. An old man, alone in this decaying house, railing against a world that had moved on without him, letting pride drag him and his legacy into ruin. And now it was my ruin. I was supposed to sign the papers. I was supposed to take the $10,000 and run. It was the only sane thing to do. It was the fresh start I so desperately needed. So why did I hesitate? Why did some small, defiant part of me want to stay? Maybe it was just that I was tired of running. For 2 years I'd lived in Mark's apartment, my name not on the lease, my possessions small enough to fit in a backpack. I had been a ghost in my own life. This farm, this disaster, it was the first thing that was mine. The debt was mine. The broken-down house was mine. The weird, creepy metal sheep were mine. Maybe, just maybe, I wanted to understand why he held on so tight, before I let it go forever. I decided to stay for the weekend, just 2 days. I'd explore the place, try to find some piece of him, some answer. Then I would call Ms. Albright and tell her to accept the offer. It was a compromise with myself, a way to say goodbye, not just to the farm, but to the grandfather I never knew. I needed to find a way to make it through the nights. The cold was the biggest enemy. In a small pantry off the kitchen, I found a stash of old candles and a box of matches. And in a chest at the foot of a bed upstairs, I found a treasure. Thick, heavy wool blankets. They smelled of mothballs and thyme, but they were warm. That night, I made a small nest for myself on the living room sofa, surrounded by a ring of flickering candles. The light pushed the deepest shadows back, but it also made them dance. The house groaned and creaked around me, a symphony of decay. I tried to read a tattered paperback I'd found on a shelf, but the words wouldn't settle in my mind. My thoughts kept drifting to the debt, to the offer, to the feeling of being trapped, and to the sheep. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was important, that I was missing something. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run away with me. It was just a weird sculpture, but the feeling persisted. It was a small, insistent hum beneath the surface of my rational thoughts. I must have drifted off because I woke up with a start. One of the candles had sputtered out. The wind was rattling the window frames, a low, mournful sound. I sat up, my heart pounding. Something had woken me, a noise. It wasn't the wind. It was a scrape, a deep, grating sound of metal on earth. It came from outside. I scrambled off the sofa, my blood running cold. I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The moon was brighter tonight, casting a silvery, ethereal glow over the fields. And my breath caught in my throat. Another one had moved. Down by the dilapidated barn, there was a sculpture of a horse, its head thrown back as if in a silent scream. I remembered it clearly from my walk. It had been near the fence line. Now it was 20 feet closer to the barn, standing stark and impossible in the center of the path. This was not in my head. This was real. Someone was out there. Someone was moving these impossibly heavy things in the dead of night. Why? Was it a threat? A warning? Were they trying to scare me off the property? Maybe Oakwood Development played rougher than Ms. Albright let on. The fear was different this time. It wasn't the vague, creeping dread of a haunted house. This was a sharp, specific fear of a human threat. I was alone out here, miles from anyone, with no phone, no car, no way to call for help. I backed away from the window, my body trembling. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the farthest corner of the room, a heavy fireplace poker clutched in my hands, my eyes fixed on the front door, waiting for the sound of the lock turning. The sun rose, and with it, my courage returned, fragile as it was. No one had tried to get in. The house was as silent as ever. But the metal horse was still there, in its new, impossible position. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. My decision to stay for the weekend had changed. It wasn't about saying goodbye anymore. It was about finding an answer. I put on my coat and went outside, the morning air crisp and cold. I walked straight to the horse. Like the sheep, it was immense, a towering thing of welded steel plates and pipes. I pushed with all my might. It was like pushing against a building. It was immovable. But this time, I saw something new. In the soft, damp earth around its base, there were tracks. Not mine. They were faint, scuffed, as if someone had tried to brush them away, but they were there. The tracks of heavy work boots. And there was something else. A long, deep gouge in the earth, leading from where the horse used to be to where it now stood. Someone had dragged it. With a machine? A winch? I walked over to the barn. The huge double doors were held shut by a thick wooden beam. I lifted it, the wood rough against my palms, and slid it free. The doors groaned open, revealing a vast cathedral-like space filled with the smell of old hay, oil, and dust. Light streamed in through cracks in the walls, illuminating a cavern of forgotten things. Old farm equipment lay rusting in the corners. Stacks of rotting lumber leaned against the walls, and in the center of it all was a cleared space, a workshop. There was a heavy-duty workbench, vices, welding tanks, and piles of scrap metal, the birthplace of the silent flock. This was his studio, my grandfather's sanctuary. This was where he had built his strange metal world. The horse had been moved to point directly at this barn. The sheep had been turned to look at the house. It wasn't random. It was a signal. Someone was trying to tell me something. They were guiding me. I started searching the workshop, my hands soon covered in a thick layer of grime. I ran my fingers along the workbench, opened dusty drawers full of rusted tools, peered into old oil drums. I was looking for, I didn't know what. A note? A clue? Anything. My eyes scanned the floor. It was mostly packed earth and concrete, stained with oil and littered with metal shavings. But over in one corner, behind a stack of old tires, I saw it. A section of the floor was different. It was made of wood. A small square of planking, about 3 feet by 3 feet, that didn't quite match the rest of the floor. It looked like a patch, a repair. But the wood was newer, cleaner. I knelt down and pushed the tires aside. I ran my fingers along the edges of the wooden square. One of the planks was slightly loose. I worked my fingers into the crack and pulled. It resisted, then came up with a low groan. Underneath was not dirt, but a dark, hollow space. And in that space sat a small black metal box, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was what they wanted me to find. The box was heavy. I lifted it out and set it on the floor. The padlock was thick and strong. There was no way I could break it. I needed a key. Where would an old, stubborn man hide a key to his deepest secrets? I thought about the sculptures, the signals, the sheep looking at the house, the horse pointing to the barn. It was a map. But where was the key? I searched the workshop again, this time with a frantic energy. Nothing. I went back outside, my eyes scanning the property, the fence line, the other sculptures. A metal cow, a goat, a pig. They were all where they had been. It was just the sheep and the horse that had moved. I walked back to the sheep, the first one that had moved, the one that stared at the house. I looked at it, really looked at it for the first time. The artistry of it, the way the pieces of scrap were chosen to mimic the texture of wool, the curve of a spine. Its eyes were empty holes in the metal gas can that formed its head. I reached out and touched it. The metal was cold, rough with rust. On a whim, I stuck my fingers inside one of the eye holes. My fingertips brushed against something small and loose inside the hollow head. My breath hitched. I worked my fingers around it, trying to grasp it. It was awkward, the opening too small. Finally, I managed to hook it and pull it out. It was a small brass key tied to a piece of twine. It was tarnished and dull, but it was a key. I ran back to the barn, my boots slipping in the mud, the key clutched in my hand. I knelt beside the metal box, my hands shaking so much I could barely fit the key into the padlock. It slid in. I turned it. With a loud, satisfying click, the lock sprang open. I took a deep breath, and I lifted the lid. Inside, the box was lined with oilcloth. There was no money, no treasure. There was just a thick stack of envelopes, bound together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. And on top of the stack, a single folded piece of paper. My name was written on it in a shaky, spidery hand. Elara. I unfolded it. It was a letter. From him. My hands trembled as I began to read. "My dearest Elara," it began. "If you are reading this, then it means I am gone. And it means you have found my last, most important work. I am sorry. I am so sorry to leave you with this burden. I tried to fix it myself, but I ran out of time. I hope you will understand. I hope you can forgive an old man for his pride." I had to stop and take a breath. The words on the page felt like a direct connection to him, a voice from the grave. I could almost hear him, his voice raspy with age. I continued reading. "You have probably been told that this farm is worthless, that I was a foolish old man drowning in debt. The lawyer, Ms. Albright, she is a good woman, but she only knows the story they wanted her to know. It is a lie, all of it. The debt is a weapon, a tool they are using to take this land. And they are trying to take it because I know their secret." My eyes scanned the lines, my heart pounding faster and faster. About 5 years ago, I started noticing things. The well water tasted strange. The trees down by the creek started looking sick, their leaves yellowing in the middle of summer. I'm just an old farmer and a junk artist, but I know this land. I know its rhythms. Something was wrong. I started taking samples, soil, water. I sent them to a lab, a friend of a friend. The results were devastating. The groundwater is poisoned. Arsenic, lead, benzene, industrial waste. The kind that doesn't just go away. The kind that causes cancer, birth defects. The kind that kills. I felt a wave of nausea. I looked out the open barn door at the brown fields, the skeletal trees. It wasn't just autumn. The land was sick. "It's coming from the adjacent property," the letter went on. "The land owned by Oakwood Development. They bought up all the surrounding farms, one by one. They told everyone they were planning a residential community, but they haven't built a thing. They are using the land to illegally dump toxic waste from their other industrial operations. They bury it in the dead of night. It's seeping into the aquifer, poisoning everything. My farm is downstream. It's the first to show the signs. But soon it will reach the town. It will poison Havenwood's water supply." I dropped the letter. I felt dizzy. Oakwood wasn't just a development company. They were criminals. And their $10,000 offer wasn't a lifeline. It was hush money. They weren't trying to buy a farm. They were trying to buy my silence. They were trying to bury the evidence, literally. I picked up the letter again, my hands shaking. I confronted them. I showed them my data. They laughed at me. They called me a crazy old man. Then they started getting aggressive. Their lawyers sent threatening letters. They fabricated debts, took out mortgages against my property using legal loopholes I couldn't understand. They built a prison of paper around me, trying to choke me out, to force me to sell so they could own the evidence, own the poisoned land, and bury their crime forever. I fought them. I spent every penny I had on lawyers, on more tests. But I was one old man against a giant. They bled me dry. I looked at the stack of envelopes in the box. They were thick, heavy. I picked one up. It was labeled Soil Sample Results, Grid C4. Inside were lab reports, pages and pages of chemical analysis, numbers and figures I didn't understand, but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. Another envelope was labeled Well Water Chronology. Another, photos, night dumping. It was all here, years of meticulous, painstaking documentation. He hadn't just been a stubborn old man. He had been a warrior, a scientist, a protector. He wasn't drowning because of his pride. He was fighting. He was fighting for this land, for the town, for me. The sculptures, the letter concluded, they are not just junk, Ilara. Each one marks a location where I took a critical sample. They are my map. My evidence is buried beneath them. The real data, the core samples, the proof that will stand up in court. I couldn't keep it all in the house. I couldn't trust the banks. I buried it, right under their noses. I hoped I would live long enough to see this through, to clear my name and leave you something of value. Not money, but a home. A clean, safe home. But my heart is giving out. I am so tired. This fight is now yours. If you want it, you can take their money. I would not blame you. You could walk away and let this place be buried. It is a terrible choice to lay at your feet, but you are my blood. You have a strength you do not yet know. This land is your inheritance, Ilara. Not the debt, the land itself, and the truth that lies buried within it. The choice is yours. Forgive me. Your loving grandfather, Arthur. I finished the letter and the barn was silent, but my ears were ringing. The weight of it all crashed down on me. The lies, the poison, the fight. My grandfather hadn't abandoned me. He had been fighting for me, for my future, in the only way he knew how. He had left me not a burden, but a sword and a shield, and a choice. An impossible choice. I sat there on the dirty floor of the barn for what felt like hours, the letter in my lap, the box of evidence beside me. The air grew colder as the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, grief, sharp and sudden, for the grandfather I had misjudged. He wasn't a failure. He was a hero who had died on his battlefield. I cried then, not for myself, not for my homelessness or my poverty, but for him, for his lonely, desperate fight, for the years he spent out here, documenting this horror while the world saw him as a crazy old man. I cried for his tired heart, for the apology he felt he had to make. Then came the anger, a hot, white rage at Oakwood Development, at their casual cruelty, their greed that valued profit over people's lives. They hadn't just tried to steal his land, they had tried to steal his name, his sanity, his legacy. They had poisoned the earth and were trying to bury the truth with a paltry $10,000. And fear, a deep, cold fear that settled in my stomach like a stone. I was 19 years old. I had nothing, no money, no power, no influence. I was a ghost, just like he had been. How could I possibly fight a multi-million-dollar corporation? They had crushed him, a man who knew the land and the science. What chance did I have? The choice he had laid at my feet felt like a death sentence either way. I could take the money, run away, and live with the knowledge that I had let them win, that I had let them poison a town, that I had sold my grandfather's legacy for a few $1,000s. I would be safe, but I would be haunted for the rest of my life. Or I could stay. I could fight. I could pick up the sword he had left me. And they would come for me. They would use their lawyers, their money, their power to crush me, just as they had crushed him. They would paint me as a liar, as an opportunist, as a crazy young woman, just like they had painted him as a crazy old man. The thought was terrifying. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. I could turn back, or I could jump. This is a moment a lot of us face, isn't it? Maybe not with poisoned land and corporate villains, but that choice between the easy wrong and the hard right. The choice between running from a fight that feels too big or planting your feet and finding out just how strong you really are. If you've ever been at a crossroads like that, I want you to let me know in the comments. What did you do? What did that moment teach you? because in that barn I felt completely and utterly alone. But I know I'm not. These are the stories that connect us. These are the battles that define us. And your story matters. So, if you're finding something of your own story in mine, hit that subscribe button. Let's build a community of people who aren't afraid of the hard fights. Now, let's get back to the barn and the choice I had to make. As darkness fell, I lit a candle and began to go through the box. I opened every envelope, my fingers tracing the charts, the photographs of trucks in the dead of night, the legal threats from Oakwood's lawyers. It was a diary of a secret war. The more I read, the more the fear began to recede, replaced by something else, a cold, hard resolve. My grandfather had not left me a choice. He had left me a responsibility. He had passed the torch. To run would be to let his fire go out, to let him have died in vain. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. I looked at his last words again. You have a strength you do not yet know. Maybe he was right. Maybe the last 2 years of living as a ghost, of learning to survive on nothing, of being invisible, had forged something in me. I had nothing to lose. What could they take from me? My non-existent money? My non-existent reputation? All I had was this broken-down farm, and the truth. And for the first time, that felt like enough. It felt like everything. My decision was made. I wasn't going to sell. I wasn't going to run. I was going to fight. I was going to finish what my grandfather started. I was going to make them pay. The first step was to find out who was moving the sculptures. Who was my silent ally, the person who had guided me to this box? I had a feeling I knew where to look. The next morning, I walked back into Havenwood, but I didn't go to Ms. Albright's office. Not yet. I went to the hardware store on the ground floor beneath it. An old man with a kind, wrinkled face and flour-dusted overalls was behind the counter. A bell chimed as I entered. "Help you with something?" he asked. "I'm looking for a friend of Arthur's," I said, my voice steady. "Arthur Croft. He was my grandfather." The man's friendly expression tightened. He looked me up and down. "You're his granddaughter? The one who inherited the farm?" I nodded. "I'm Ilara." He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned on the counter, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "I heard you were in town. Heard you were meeting with the lawyer. Figured you'd be signing the papers and leaving by now." "I'm not signing anything," I said quietly. A flicker of something, surprise, hope, crossed his face. "My name's George," he said. "Art and I were friends for 50 years. I was worried they'd scared you off." "Was it you?" I asked. "Moving the sculptures?" He let out a long, slow breath and nodded. "I had to. Art made me promise. He said if anything happened to him, and if you showed up, I was supposed to guide you. But not too directly. He knew Oakwood would be watching the property, watching me. He was paranoid at the end, but it turns out he wasn't paranoid enough. I couldn't just walk up and hand you a map. So I did what he told me. I moved the horse. I moved the sheep. I pointed you in the right direction. I was hoping you'd be smart enough to figure it out." "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. "With the evidence?" George gave a sad, bitter laugh. "Kid, the sheriff plays golf with the regional manager from Oakwood every Thursday. The town council is practically on their payroll, drooling over the promise of new development and tax revenue. Art tried. He went to everyone. They all shut him down, labeled him a crank. This isn't a fight you win by playing by the normal rules." The sense of isolation my grandfather must have felt hit me again. He had been completely alone, except for this one loyal friend. "Thank you, George," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means." "Art was a good man," he said gruffly. "He loved that land, and he loved you, even if you didn't get to know him. He talked about you all the time, said he was fighting to save the farm for his granddaughter." He looked at me, his eyes serious. "So, what's your plan, Alara? You've got the evidence. What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to use it," I said. And for the first time, I had a plan. I walked out of the hardware store and up the creaking stairs to Ms. Albright's office. I didn't have an appointment. Her secretary tried to stop me, but I walked right past her and into the office. Ms. Albright looked up from her paperwork, her expression one of annoyance that quickly shifted to surprise. "Alara, I wasn't expecting you. Have you made a decision about the offer?" "I have," I said, standing in front of her desk. I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone. "I'm not selling." She sighed, taking off her glasses. "Alara, we went over this. There is no other option. Foreclosure is inevitable. You'll walk away with nothing but your grandfather's debt. You told me my grandfather was a stubborn man who didn't understand business," I said, my voice level. "You told me he was drowning and refused to grab the rope. You were wrong. He wasn't drowning. He was being held underwater." I reached into my backpack and pulled out the black metal box. I placed it on her desk with a heavy thud. "This is why he refused to sell." I opened it and took out Arthur's letter, placing it on top. "Read it." She hesitated, then picked up the letter. I watched her face as she read. I saw her professional composure slowly crumble. Her eyes widened. Her mouth fell slightly open. She read it once, then read it again, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock, and then to a quiet, simmering anger. She put the letter down and looked at the box, then at me. Is this real?" she whispered. "It's all in there," I said, gesturing to the box. "Lab reports, photos, legal documents, years of evidence. He wasn't in debt because he was a bad businessman. He was in debt because he was fighting a secret war, and he was winning the battles, but losing the war of attrition. The debt is fraudulent. The whole thing is a criminal conspiracy to cover up an environmental disaster." Ms. Albright was silent for a full minute. She stared at the box, her mind clearly racing, re-evaluating everything she thought she knew about Arthur Croft, about Oakwood Development, about the last 5 years of her own professional life. She had been their unwitting pawn, the respectable face they used to legitimize their scheme. "They made a fool of me," she said, her voice barely audible. "They used me." Her eyes met mine, and I saw something new in them. The pragmatic, detached lawyer was gone. In her place was a woman who had been lied to, whose professional integrity had been compromised. And she was furious. "All right, Alara," she said, her voice now sharp and clear, all business once more, but a different kind of business. "You told me you're not selling. So tell me, what is it you want to do?" "I want to fight," I said. "I want to finish what my grandfather started. I want to expose them, and I want to save my farm." A slow smile spread across her face. It was a fearsome sight. "Good," she said, "because I'm an excellent lawyer, and I've just been given the case of a lifetime. They wanted a war? We'll give them a war." That day, everything changed. Ms. Albright's office became our war room. She made copies of everything in the box, securing the originals in her firm's vault. She made a phone call to a friend of hers in the city, a high-powered environmental lawyer who specialized in suing corporate polluters. She described the case, the evidence my grandfather had collected. There was a long silence on our end as she listened. Then she said, "Yes, the chain of custody is impeccable. His friend George can testify to the final piece. The granddaughter is here now. She's formidable." She hung up the phone and looked at me. "He's taking the case, pro bono. He thinks we can't just sue them. We can get the EPA involved. He thinks we can press for criminal charges." The word criminal hung in the air. This was bigger than I could have ever imagined. George became our silent partner, providing a sworn affidavit about his promise to Arthur and his role in moving the sculptures. He also remembered other details, the makes and models of trucks he'd seen near the Oakwood property late at night, dates of strange chemical smells wafting over from their land. Little things that, when combined with my grandfather's meticulous records, painted an undeniable picture of guilt. The next step was a bold one. Ms. Albright drafted a letter to Oakwood Development. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. It stated that we had incontrovertible proof of their illegal dumping and the fraudulent nature of the debt against the Croft property. It gave them 48 hours to cancel all outstanding debt, make a public apology, and establish a multi-million-dollar cleanup fund for the farm and the surrounding aquifer. If they failed to comply, the evidence would be turned over to the Environmental Protection Agency and the District Attorney's Office. "This is poking the bear," she warned me. "They're going to come back at us hard." "Let them," I said. I spent those 48 hours back at the farm. It felt different now. It wasn't a place of fear or decay. It was my fortress, my inheritance. The metal sculptures in the field no longer looked like creepy junk. They were guardians, sentinels standing watch over the truth. I spent my time cleaning. I washed the windows, swept the floors, and aired out the musty rooms. I was reclaiming the space, breathing life back into it. It was hard work, but it felt good. It felt like I was honoring him. The call came on the second day. It was Ms. Albright. "They blinked," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. "Their chief counsel is flying in from the city. They want a meeting. They're scared, Alara. They're scared." The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The meeting with Oakwood's lawyers was tense and adversarial. They tried to intimidate me, to belittle my grandfather's evidence, to offer me a larger but still insulting sum of money to go away. But I wasn't the same person who had stepped off that bus a week earlier. I sat there, with Ms. Albright by my side, and I didn't flinch. I just said, no. We showed them a fraction of our proof, just enough to let them know that we had them, and that we weren't bluffing. The legal battle would drag on for months, a slow, grinding process of motions and depositions. But the momentum had shifted. We had the truth on our side, and we had my grandfather's legacy. During that time, the farm became my home, truly my home. George helped me get the power turned back on and the water running. The townspeople, who had once seen my grandfather as a crank, started looking at me with a newfound respect. Some would stop by, leaving a basket of vegetables on the porch, or offering to help fix a section of the fence. They knew I was fighting for them, too. I started tending to the land. I cleared the weeds, tilled a small garden, and planted seeds. I was nurturing the poisoned earth, believing that it could be healed, just like me. I never felt alone in that house again. It was filled with the presence of my grandfather, not as a ghost, but as a source of strength. I would sit on the porch in the evenings and look out at his metal sculptures, standing stark against the sunset. They weren't just markers for soil samples anymore. They were art. They were a statement. They were the story of a man who loved his land enough to fight for it, and who trusted his granddaughter to finish the job. He had left me something far more valuable than money or property. He had left me a purpose. He had left me a home, not just a house, but a place in the world to stand my ground. He had shown me that inheritance isn't about what you are given. It's about what you choose to do with it. My life was no longer a series of doors closing behind me. I had found a door that opened forward, into a future I could build myself. And I was finally home. Looking back, the farm taught me that the most valuable things are never the easiest. Home isn't a place you're given. It's a place you fight for, a place you build, a place you heal. My grandfather's legacy wasn't debt and decay. It was courage and truth. He left me a battle, and in doing so, he gave me a way to find myself. He showed me that even when you feel like you have nothing, you can still stand for something. And sometimes, that's the only thing that matters. The fight against Oakwood is still going on, but we are winning. The EPA is involved, and the truth is coming to light. The land is slowly on its way to being healed, and I'm still here. This farm is my home now, and I'm not going anywhere. This journey started with me being homeless, lost, and afraid. It led me to a place of strength, purpose, and belonging that I never could have imagined. It taught me that sometimes the things that seem broken are just waiting for someone to see their true worth. So I want to ask you, what is the farm in your life? What is that thing that seems like a burden, but is actually a hidden gift? What battle have you inherited that has defined who you are? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I believe in the power of sharing our struggles. It reminds us that we are not alone in our fights. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in second chances and fighting for what's right, then please subscribe to the channel and join our community. Because everyone has a story worth telling, and every fight for truth makes the world a little brighter. Thank you for listening.